In 1987, inside a small house in Pittsburgh filled with the chill of winter, a retired steelworker lived on about $11 a week for food. Every evening he set the same old stew pot on the cast iron stove and ate the same dish for years. His doctor once said his blood test results were better than those of many men only half his age. He had learned how to cook these foods from his mother during the years of the Great Depression. Dish number 18 was once cooked for less than $1 in church kitchens during the winter. Dish number 9 came about because an elderly widow no longer had the strength to stand by the stove for very long. And dish number 1, a bowl of savory porridge with a little bacon grease, once helped Appalachian miners step down into the cold, dark earth before sunrise. Stay with me through this story. Somewhere among those 25 old dishes you may recognize a kitchen, a pot, or someone who once quietly cooked to get through hard days. 15 cents. That was once enough for an immigrant family in New York to have a hot pot of soup for dinner in the 1940s. In West Virginia, many mothers kept the whole house going through the cold season with only potatoes, onions, and a little bacon grease left at the bottom of the pan. Did anyone in your family ever keep bacon grease in an old coffee can? Before frozen foods and canned dinners filled American supermarkets, many working-class kitchens began the evening with one very simple question. What was left in the cupboard to put into the pot? The last days of the month were often quieter than usual. The sound of coins touching each other inside a small tin box could be heard clearly in the middle of the room, while the old radio played very softly in the corner of the kitchen. Dish number 25, tomato and bread soup. The smell of hot tomatoes mixed with old bread slowly softening in the dark red pot of soup, creating a scent that was slightly sour and gently sweet, the scent of an end-of-the-month kitchen where the yellow light was still on. In Italian immigrant neighborhoods in Philadelphia and New York, many families once cooked this dish for around 10 to 15 cents. Old bread was torn into small pieces and dropped into a pot of boiling tomatoes. Just a few minutes later, the inside of the bread melted into the soup, making it thicker and filling enough for the whole family. An old flour sack towel hanging beside the stove still carried the smell of tomatoes through many winters. For many working families, a dry loaf of bread was never seen as something to throw away, and the next dish was even cheaper. Dish number 24, potato and onion soup. In many homes in West Virginia during the 1930s and 1940s, a pot of potato and onion soup costing about 12 to 18 cents often sat on the stove through long, cold evenings in the middle of a mountain winter. Grandmother sliced onions on a wooden cutting board darkened by many years of use, while the pot of potatoes slowly softened on a small coal stove. When a little bacon grease touched the hot broth, the smell of the whole room changed at once. Outside the door, the winter wind was still whistling through the cracks in the old wood. Many mountain families always kept potatoes and onions in a basket in the kitchen because they could last for a very long time through the cold season. Dish number 23, ham bone and bean soup. A ham bone lay at the bottom of the pot as if it still had unfinished work to do. Around it, white beans began to swell and soften in the hot water, while the sound of a spoon stirring moved very slowly through the kitchen of a Pennsylvania steel town. Around 1990, many working families still bought a 1-pound bag of white beans for about 69 cents to cook into a pot of soup that was enough for several meals through the coldest weeks. The aluminum ladle lightly touched the side of the pot every few seconds as the beans slowly softened over low heat. A metal lunchbox covered with coal dust still sat beside the doorway, waiting for the morning shift the next day. But those end-of-the-month pots of soup were only the beginning. The next dishes were cooked to keep people strong enough to keep going through the longest winter. A head of cabbage for less than $1 could feed a whole family through many dinners in the 1940s. A 60-cent pot of chili sometimes sat on the stove for 3 days in a row. And in many old working towns across America, the smell of hot food often came before the words, "How was your day?" Did you ever know a kitchen like that too? The screen door snapped open. Shoes covered in coal dust were set down on the wooden floor. A metal lunch pail was placed beside the door. Then someone lifted the lid off the pot. Dish number 22, cabbage and sausage. In Polish working-class neighborhoods in Chicago and German families in Wisconsin during the 1940s to the 1950s, one large head of cabbage was often used for almost an entire cold week. Grandmother cut the sausage into very thin slices, not to make the dish look better, only so everyone would feel like their share was a little bigger. The smoky smell from the sausage quickly clung to the coats hanging beside the stove. As the cabbage slowly softened under the pot lid, the small radio on top of the refrigerator was still playing the late-night weather report. More snow was coming. Many people later remembered the smell of the sausage more than the actual piece of meat they had eaten that night, and the next dish was once found in almost every kitchen cupboard in rural America. Dish number 21: rice stew with canned chicken. A can of chicken sat deep in the dark corner of the pantry, beside boxes of beans and bags of dried noodles saved for the days when thick snow covered the road leading into the small town. In many rural American kitchens during the 1970s and 1980s, people often cooked a pot of rice stew with canned chicken for about 50 to 70 cents when money for fresh meat had nearly run out after a long work week. She opened the can of chicken with a can opener whose screw had already gone loose. Cold rice was poured straight into the pot with a little milk left at the bottom of the glass bottle. No one in the kitchen said much. Only the stew could be heard simmering very softly. Dishes like that never appeared in famous cookbooks, but they fed many families through long winters. Dish number 20: chili with beans. Beans, tomatoes, and chili powder bubbled in a large cast-iron pot set in the middle of the stove. That sound moved slowly and steadily, like the footsteps of workers coming home very late after the evening shift. In working-class neighborhoods in Texas during the 1940s and 1950s, a pot of chili with beans costing about 60 to 80 cents was often enough for several shifts in a row. The strange thing is that many people believed chili tasted better after being left on the stove overnight. By the next morning, the broth was thicker, spicier, and much richer in flavor. "Heat this pot again tomorrow," he said as he set his bowl down on the table, and in many old working-class homes, that was almost always the highest praise anyone could give a dinner. In many old homes across America, soup was often the last thing people still had enough strength to eat after a day of sickness or deep exhaustion. A hot bowl, a chair was pulled close to the stove. Sometimes, that alone was enough to make someone feel a little better. Did anyone in your family ever make soup whenever the whole house came down with a cold? During long winters, many working-class kitchens became quieter than usual. All that remained was the very soft sound of water boiling and a spoon lightly touching the side of a ceramic bowl. Dish number 19: egg drop soup. In working-class Chinatown neighborhoods in the 1940s, many families made egg drop soup for less than $2 on cold, rainy days or when someone in the house was sick. Grandmother beat the eggs in a chipped enamel bowl, stirred the broth into a small whirlpool, then poured the eggs in a very thin stream onto the surface of the steaming pot. After that, she turned off the heat very quickly so the eggs would stay soft and rise into pale yellow ribbons. Just one small egg was enough to make the whole kitchen feel gently cared for. Some families also added a little cornstarch to make the soup thicker and stretch it into one more bowl. Dish number 18: lentil and carrot stew. In the 1990s, many church communities in Missouri were still cooking lentils and carrots for less than $1 to bring to elderly people who lived alone. The interesting thing is that today, lentils appear on many expensive superfood menus. But many years earlier, they were simply a cheap food that helped working people stay full longer through the winter. Grandmother poured the lentils into a faded tin colander, then added them to the pot with finely chopped carrots. While the soup simmered, a few people began brushing snow off their coats before sitting down at the long church table. No one asked whether the food was special or not. It was cold. People needed dinner. But the next dish was the one whose smell almost every child in the Midwest remembered. Dish number 17: corn soup. After the harvest season, the small kitchen lit up with the yellow color of freshly cut corn kernels. The sound of the soup simmering mixed with the smell of hot milk, making the whole house feel as if it were holding on to a little of the last sunlight of autumn. In rural parts of the Midwest during the 1940s and 1950s, many families made corn soup for about 20 to 30 cents as a hot dinner for the first days of winter. When cold winds began blowing across the empty fields, the corn was cut from the cob, then simmered with milk in a deep pot set beside a window covered in cold mist. The sweet smell of hot corn made the kitchen still feel like the end of summer, even though winter winds had already begun moving in across the fields. "Cook a little more," the child said, holding the bowl out in front of them. And in many old farmhouse kitchens, that was almost always the most honest compliment anyone could give to the pot of soup that evening. A bag of dried beans, a large pot of noodles, one stewed chicken for the whole church community. For many working American families, those filling dishes once mattered more than any famous recipe in the newspapers or on television. After the light bowls of soup for sick days, the working-class kitchen returned to heavier pots of food, enough to keep people full through a long work shift. Dish number 16. Black-eyed pea stew. The smoky smell from an old ham bone slowly melted into the pot of black-eyed peas simmering over low heat. Thick steam covered the kitchen window in the south, while the wall clock ticked steadily through the late-night house. In Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia during the 1940s, many families often bought ham bones for under $1 per pound to stew with black-eyed peas for several days. Black-eyed peas were once seen as food for surviving hard times, but today, many Southern restaurants sell them as traditional comfort food. Grandmother soaked the beans in a faded enamel bowl the night before, then set the pot on the stove early in the morning. By evening, the smoky smell from the ham bone had filled the small room. A work shirt still carrying sawdust hung by the door after the afternoon shift. A bag of beans, a scrap of bone. Many families made it through winter with exactly that much. Dish number 15. One-pot macaroni and beef. The pot lid trembled lightly on the stove as the macaroni and tomatoes boiled together with ground beef. From the narrow hallway, the sound of children running into the kitchen came quickly after the smell of hot sauce. Ground beef, dry pasta, and canned tomatoes kept boiling together in a deep pot whose bottom had turned black with age. A tin lunchbox covered in machine oil sat beside the sink. In Detroit, working families during the 1960s and 1970s, a pot of macaroni with beef and tomatoes costing about 70 to 90 cents was often enough for the whole family after a shift at the auto plant. The interesting thing is that this kind of one-pot pasta now appears all over cooking videos online, but many decades earlier, it was simply a way to make dinner faster and wash fewer dishes. No one asked whether the dish was special. The whole family was just very hungry. But the next dish was the one that often appeared at someone's door during the hardest days. Dish number 14. Chicken and dumplings. In many Southern communities around the mid-1980s, people often brought a large pot of chicken and dumplings to the home of someone who was sick or had just gone through a loss. No one brought steak to a house where someone was hurting. Rain tapped softly on the porch roof while the pot of chicken kept simmering on the stove. Grandmother pulled the tender chicken meat from the bones, then dropped each piece of dough into the hot broth. The Pyrex tray covered with a cotton towel was still sitting beside the door, ready to be carried over to the house next door. "So they won't have to cook tonight," the woman said before leaving. In the poor kitchens of old America, many ingredients were rarely used for just one meal. One can of tomatoes had to make a pot of pasta fuller. One can of salmon had to be enough for many small cakes placed around the dinner table. And the bag of dried beans sitting on the dark wooden shelf was often what kept the whole family going through the coldest final weeks of the month. Dish number 13. One-pot tomato macaroni. The smell of hot tomatoes rose from the pot of macaroni simmering on the stove. Outside the window, the sound of cars passing along the rain-wet street echoed softly on a weekend evening. In many working-class apartments in the eastern United States during the 1950s, just about 25 to 40 cents was enough for a large pot of tomato macaroni, even when there was no meat left in the kitchen. The mother poured canned tomatoes into the pot of soft macaroni, then let it stay on low heat for a few more minutes until the red sauce thickened. The youngest child always liked to wipe up the sauce still clinging to the sides of the pot with a piece of stale bread left from the morning. The faded tablecloth trembled slightly each time someone pulled out a chair and sat down. Outside, the weather was still cold. Inside, there were hot tomatoes. Dish number 12. Canned salmon cakes. The sizzling sound of salmon cakes was very clear on the hot cast iron pan during a long rainy evening in the Pacific Northwest. In working families during the 1950s, a can of salmon costing less than $2 was often mashed with breadcrumbs to make many small cakes for a weekend dinner. Grandmother opened the can of fish with a can opener whose handle had been worn down from use, then pressed each round piece of fish with the palm of her hand, still dusted with a little flour. In the corner of the kitchen, the small radio played an old song mixed with the sound of rain tapping on the porch roof. When the edges of the cakes began to turn golden and crisp, the smell of hot oil made the room feel less cold, too. "Cook this again tomorrow," she said. "It'll be even better." Dish number 11, navy bean soup. A bag of white navy beans sat quietly in the corner of the old kitchen cupboard, like the last bit of savings for the days when money was almost gone. Since the early 20th century, thick pots of bean soup had appeared in East Coast boarding houses and in poor working-class kitchens all through the long winter. Grandmother soaked the beans overnight in a large tin basin, then simmered them for a long time with onions and a small piece of bone left from the previous meal. The pot lid shook softly with the steam while the clock on the wall ticked through the cold evening. By the time the soup thickened and the beans softened until they split open, the house finally smelled like a real dinner. When a house that used to be full of children's footsteps had only the ticking of the clock and the low simmer of a pot on the stove, dinner began to mean something different. Some people had once cooked for a large family, and many years later, they were setting only one bowl on the table. In some old houses, the soft rattle of a pot lid was sometimes the only thing keeping the kitchen from becoming too quiet. Dish number 10, one-pot tuna noodles. On a still Wednesday afternoon, the light outside the window had faded across the old floral curtains. The radio beside the glass salt jar was still playing a familiar song very softly while the smell of hot cream of mushroom soup and tuna began to drift through the small kitchen. From 1955 to 1985, many farm families in Nebraska often cooked one-pot tuna noodles for about 40 to 60 cents on evenings when they needed something easy to make and still enough to warm up the next day. Then she poured the egg noodles into the boiling water and set the old kitchen towel over her shoulder, a habit she had kept for many years. The can of tuna was opened slowly, then mixed with cream of mushroom soup until the sauce clung to the soft noodles. Dish number 9. Potato soup. An old hand held a white enamel bowl with a towel worn thin at the edges because the soup was still too hot. Out on the porch, the winter wind slipped through the old screen door, making the small bell in front of the house give off a few faint, delicate sounds. In many American homes during the Great Depression years of the 1930s and 1940s, potato soup was often cooked with the last few coins left in a coat pocket at the end of the week. Grandmother peeled the potatoes very slowly beside a patterned plate with one chipped corner, then dropped them into a pot of gently simmering broth. As the potatoes softened and the soup began to thicken, the whole kitchen felt a little less cold. Sometimes one hot bowl set down on the table was enough to make the evening pass a little more easily. Dish number 8, sausage and white bean stew. The smell of smoked sausage, soft white beans, and hot tomatoes drifted slowly through the small apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Chicago. On the chair beside the door, the old metal lunch pail still sat where it had been set down earlier in the evening, next to a coat that still carried the smell of cold wind from the street. In the 1950s, many Chicago working families often cooked a pot of sausage and white bean stew for about 45 to 60 cents on days when they needed a filling meal, with enough left for breakfast the next morning. Mother seared the sausage in the pot until its fragrant fat rose, then poured in the beans and tomatoes too similarly. The sound of a spoon touching the side of a bowl echoed very softly as the house gradually settled into quiet. After evenings that were too quiet, the kitchen needed to hear a few familiar sounds again. The soft touch of a knife against an old wooden cutting board. The gentle rattle of a pot lid as the broth began to heat. Some dishes did not make the house feel crowded or lively again, but they still kept the feeling that someone would soon sit down at the table. Dish number 7, beef and vegetable soup. An old basket of vegetables sat beside a kitchen towel faded from many years of use. Carrots with softened ends, a few slightly wilted celery stalks, and a small piece of beef left from the previous meal were still kept separately on an enamel plate with a chipped rim. In railroad families in the Midwest during the 1940s, people often cooked beef and vegetable soup for about 80 cents to $1, depending on how much meat was left that day. The distant sound of a train whistle carried into the small apartment while grandmother cut the vegetables into hand-sized pieces and dropped them into the gently simmering broth. The wooden chair beside the stove still held a thick coat covered with coal dust from the afternoon shift. By late night, more than half the pot of soup was gone. Dish number 6, red beans and rice. On Monday morning, the pot of red beans began simmering very early in a New Orleans kitchen that still smelled of soap and freshly washed clothes. Out in the backyard, the sound of wet towels striking the clothesline rang steadily through the hot, humid morning. In many working-class neighborhoods of New Orleans during the 1940s, red beans and rice were often cooked for about 25 to 35 cents, using dried beans and the meat left over from the previous weekend. Grandmother soaked the beans overnight, then sautéed onions with celery in a hot pan before pouring everything into the large pot. The ceiling fan turned slowly above the dining table while the smell of soft beans and smoked meat spread through the small house. By afternoon, there was still a full pot left to warm up the next day. Dish number 5, Great Depression stew. In a small Pittsburgh steelworker's apartment during the Great Depression years of the 1930s, less than $5 was sometimes enough for a large pot of stew divided into several dinners in a row. Snow clung white to the iron railing outside, while a pair of work gloves wet with melted ice was placed beside the front door. Grandmother put tomatoes, corn, and potatoes into the pot first, then added a little beef that was still left under the old freezer compartment. The spoon touched the side of the pot a few times before the whole house settled into quiet. The stew was left over low heat for many hours until the liquid thickened and a layer of red fat began to rise around the edge of the pot. The next morning, the stove still held a little warmth. The closer we get to the end of the list, the simpler the dishes become. A cheap chicken thigh, a long-cooked pot of pinto beans, a steaming bowl of chicken soup in the cold season, and then, at the very end, only oats, a little bacon grease, and a blue dark morning before work. Those dishes were never made to impress anyone. They were kept because they had once helped so many people keep going through the heaviest days. Dish number 4, rice cooked with chicken thighs. The smell of lightly burned chicken skin slowly spread through the small kitchen of a southern textile millworker's neighborhood. Steam rose from the pot of rice, carrying the rich smell of chicken fat still lingering on the surface of the old cast-iron stove. In many southern workers' homes during the 1950s, chicken thighs were often about 69 cents per pound and were seen as a cheap cut of meat, enough to cook into a filling pot of rice for the whole family after work. Grandmother pressed the chicken thighs down into the cast-iron pan until the skin was slightly charred and the fat began to render, then poured the rice into the pot with the broth saved from the previous meal. After that, she simmered it very slowly so each grain of rice could soak up the hot richness of that small piece of meat. In textile mill homes, people understood the value of cheap cuts of meat very well. They did not need to look pretty. They only needed to be strong enough to keep working people full until the next morning. Cheap meat still fed the house. Dish number 3, pinto beans and cornbread. In the Ozarks, the pot of pinto beans was often already on the stove from early in the day. Beside it sat a sack of cornmeal tied with an old string, a low stool, and a pot of black coffee already half cold. In rural parts of the South during the 1930s and 1940s, about 15 to 25 cents could be enough for pinto beans and cornbread on days when cash was almost gone. The beans were soaked the night before and cooked until soft, while the cornbread was quickly pressed on the hot pan until the edges dried out. Some dinners had nothing else besides those two things, but the whole house still sat down around the table. Dish number 2, chicken soup. A wool blanket was draped over the back of a chair. A bottle of cough medicine sat beside the sink. In a small wooden house in rural America during the 1940s, a pot of chicken soup costing about 75 cents to $1 was often cooked for someone sick, someone tired, or on long days of cold rain. Grandmother stewed the chicken with onions and celery, then pulled the still tender meat into small pieces. The bowl was placed on the table near the edge of the bed, without the need for many words. The person in the house only needed to smell the hot broth to know that someone was still paying attention to whether they had eaten. Dish number 1, savory oatmeal with bacon grease. Before dawn, the kitchen in the Appalachian mining country was still blue dark and bitterly cold. A bowl of hot oatmeal steamed very slowly on the wooden table, while the faint smell of scorched bacon quietly filled the small room. In the mining camps during the Great Depression of the 1930s, people often cooked a bowl of savory oatmeal for about 8 to 12 cents before it was time to go down into the mines. Outside the window, early morning fog still lay thick over the dirt road leading into the mountains. The mother stirred the oats in boiling water with a wooden spoon darkened by the years, scraped the last bit of bacon grease from the skillet into the pot, then seasoned it with a little salt before ladling the oatmeal into a bowl while its surface still shone faintly from the hot fat. The miner did not need an elaborate breakfast before a hard day of labor underground. He needed something hot, salty, and filling enough to stay in his stomach for a long time while the sky had not yet fully brightened. A small meal against a very heavy day. A bowl of oatmeal like that made no one richer. But it helped a man stand up on a cold morning, put on his old coat, step out the door, and keep going through one more day. The 25 dishes we have just passed through never belonged to fancy restaurants or beautifully printed menus. They came from old working-class kitchens, where almost nothing was thrown away too soon. A bone could still make one more pot of broth. A bag of dried beans could help the whole family get through many cold days. Even a small piece of meat was enough to bring a little more reassurance to the dinner table. The last recipe card was placed back into the wooden box. The edge of the paper had grown soft from years of being touched, and one corner still held an old oil stain that no one had ever wiped clean. When the lid of the box closed, the sound of the wood was very small against the tabletop, as if the kitchen had just held on to the final piece of a time long gone. Maybe your home once had a dish like that too. A pot warmed up again and again. A dinner no one ever wrote into a book, but the people who once sat around that table still remember. If this story made you remember someone who once cooked for you, write their name in the comments. Just one name. They deserve to be mentioned one more time.